What would you do if three women you saw every single day, women of faith, women you trusted, suddenly vanished into the night, leaving not a single trace? That question haunted an entire village in the spring of 1991. It wasn't a city filled with endless strangers, where people come and go unnoticed. No, this was a small, tightly woven community where faces were familiar, doors were left unlocked, and the sound of church bells was as much a part of life as the sunrise. But one morning, those bells rang into a silence so heavy that it seemed unnatural. Because that morning, the convent stood empty. Three nuns who had lived, worked, and prayed there had simply disappeared. Their rooms were untouched, their belongings neatly folded, their beds unslept in. They were gone. The shock rippled through the village like fire in dry grass. Mothers pulled their children closer. Farmers stopped in their tracks, whispering prayers. And at the heart of it all stood the church, once a place of solace, now shadowed with unease. At first, it seemed impossible. These were women who had chosen a life of devotion, a life bound not only by faith but by duty. They weren't the kind to run off into the night without explanation. They were part of the fabric of the village, teaching in the small parish school, tending to the sick, comforting the dying. To imagine them vanishing willingly, no one could. But what happened that night in 1991 would remain a mystery for 20 long years. A mystery buried in silence, unanswered questions, and secrets the walls of the convent seemed to hold tight. And then, 2 decades later, one priest would stumble on a discovery so disturbing, so unthinkable, that it would shake the community to its very core. But before we get there, we have to go back to the days before the vanishing, when the nuns were still a living, breathing presence in the village. The convent itself sat at the edge of the settlement, its whitewashed walls catching the late sun like a beacon. It wasn't large or grand, just a simple building, 2 stories, with a small chapel where candles burned day and night. Behind it stretched fields that the nuns worked by hand, growing vegetables and herbs they shared with the poor. The 3 women who lived there were more than just symbols of faith. Sister Agnes, the eldest, was stern but kind-hearted, her voice always steady, her hands always busy with work. She was seen as the anchor of the convent. Sister Margaret, younger, had a warmth about her that drew people in. She was known for her laughter, her songs drifting from the chapel when she thought no one was listening. And then there was Sister Catherine, the youngest, barely 30, with a quiet intensity. She was thoughtful, often lingering in prayer long after the others had gone. They were different in age and temperament, yet bound together by routine and devotion. They rose before dawn, prayed, worked, taught, visited the sick, and prayed again. Their presence was steady, predictable. Until the night, everything changed. It was late March. The air was sharp, carrying the last bite of winter. The village had gone to sleep early, shutters drawn against the wind. Inside the convent, a candle still burned in the window, a sign, as always, that prayers were being said. Then, sometime in the night, the light went out. By morning, the convent stood silent, too silent. When the housekeeper arrived to prepare breakfast, she found the kitchen untouched. No bread rising, no fire in the stove. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, as though no one had slept in them at all. Their habits hung in the wardrobes. Their prayer books rested on the nightstands. The only thing missing were the women themselves. Panic spread quickly. Villagers gathered outside the convent, calling their names, searching the grounds, scouring the fields and woods. The police were summoned, but there was nothing. No broken window, no sign of struggle, no tracks in the dirt road outside. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The theories began almost immediately. Had they been kidnapped? If so, why? What ransom could 3 humble nuns be worth? Some whispered of darker possibilities, that they had been silenced for something they knew, or punished for some hidden sin. Others insisted it had to be a divine mystery, a miracle or a curse. But the reality was colder, harsher. They were gone, and no one knew why. What made the case so chilling wasn't just the disappearance itself, but the lack of any trail. In crimes, there are usually traces, a footprint, a dropped item, a witness who saw something. Here, there was nothing. Every avenue investigators tried to follow ended in silence. Every clue dissolved into dust. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The convent doors stayed shut. The villagers carried on, but with unease lingering in every shadow. And still, no answers came. What happened next would turn this mystery into something far darker. Because as the years passed, the disappearance of the three nuns became more than just an unsolved case. It became a wound that would fester in silence until, 20 years later, a priest stumbled upon something that forced open every locked door of the past. And what he found was worse than anyone could have imagined. The village itself was not remarkable. A cluster of stone cottages, smoke rising from chimneys, narrow dirt lanes winding between them. To outsiders, it might have seemed unremarkable, a place time had forgotten. But to those who lived there, it was the whole world, a place of routine, of closeness, of whispered gossip that spread faster than the wind. At its heart stood the church, modest in size but towering in presence. Its steeple rose above the rooftops, casting a long shadow at sunset. 4 generations, it had been the center of life, baptisms, weddings, funerals, Sunday sermons that bound everyone together. And beside it, the convent. The 3 women who lived there were as much a part of the community as the bell that tolled each hour. People didn't just see them as nuns. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Sister Agnes was the eldest, already in her late 50s by 1991. Years of devotion had shaped her into a woman of discipline. Her steps were brisk, her eyes sharp, her words carefully chosen. She ran the small school connected to the parish, teaching children their letters and numbers, but also the quiet dignity of respect. Villagers often said she had a way of seeing straight through a person, as though she could read hearts as easily as books. Some children feared her strictness, but most remembered her fairness, and all knew she cared for them deeply. Sister Margaret was different. 10 years younger, she carried a warmth that softened every room she entered. She could be found in kitchens, helping mothers bake bread, or sitting at bedsides, soothing the sick with a hand on their brow. Her laugh was distinctive, bright, ringing, contagious. Even in the convent, when days grew heavy with prayer and silence, her voice would lift in song. She had once been told she might have had a career in music, but she gave it up, choosing instead to devote her voice to hymns. Villagers called her the singing sister. And then there was Sister Catherine. Youngest of the 3, barely 30, she carried herself with an intensity that was harder to read. She was quieter than the others, but when she spoke, it was with conviction. She seemed drawn to solitude, often found in the chapel, kneeling long after the others had retired, whispering prayers that no one else could hear. Some thought her distant, even austere. Others believed she was simply consumed by faith. A few, however, noted a different quality, a sadness in her eyes, as though she carried a private burden. Together, they were known as the 3 Sisters of the White House, for the convent's pale walls that glowed under the sun. They had been inseparable for years, seen together in fields, markets, and the narrow lanes of the village. To the villagers, their presence meant stability. People trusted them with secrets, with confessions, with hopes and fears that they might never share with anyone else. Their absence, therefore, was unimaginable. But before their disappearance, there were whispers, small ones, barely noticed at the time. The convent had always been a place of peace, but in the weeks before the vanishing, villagers recalled later, a certain unease seemed to hang over it. The sisters, usually cheerful when seen together, appeared subdued. Their faces were drawn, their conversations hushed. Sister Catherine especially seemed unsettled, glancing often over her shoulder, as if something unseen followed her. One villager, a widow who lived near the convent, remembered how she had once asked Catherine if she was unwell. Catherine had smiled faintly, but said nothing, only pressing the woman's hand before walking on. The widow later told investigators she thought the young nun looked frightened, though of what she could not say. And then there was the matter of the locked room. The convent was simple, with just a handful of rooms, bedrooms, a kitchen, a prayer hall, and storage. But there was one door, tucked at the end of a corridor, that was always locked. Few villagers ever entered the convent, but the sisters themselves admitted to others that the room was off limits. Used, they said, for storing church archives and old items. Yet one child, who had sneaked inside the convent once while delivering bread, swore he heard strange noises from behind it, like whispers or scratching. Of course, no one believed him. Children imagined all kinds of things. Still, the locked room remained a point of quiet curiosity. As March 1991 approached, the sisters continued their routines. They taught children, worked the gardens, cared for the sick. Outwardly, little had changed, but small cracks had begun to show. Sister Margaret, once quick to laugh, seemed distracted. Sister Agnes grew sharper, scolding children for trifles she once ignored. Catherine's silences grew longer. And then came the final week. On the Sunday before their disappearance, the sisters attended Mass, as usual. The church was full, the villagers gathered, the priest delivering his sermon in the dim glow of candles. All three nuns sat in the front pew, their heads bowed. But witnesses later said that Catherine kept lifting her gaze, scanning the congregation, her eyes lingering on a man in the back row. No one knew his name. He wasn't from the village. He had appeared weeks earlier, seen here and there, keeping mostly to himself. That morning, his eyes met Catherine's, and she looked away quickly. By nightfall, he was gone. No one saw him again. It was only after the disappearance that villagers remembered him at all. The days leading up to March 25th were uneventful on the surface, but something was shifting. Sister Margaret was overheard telling a parishioner, "Pray for us." When asked why, she only shook her head. Sister Agnes, in the schoolroom, seemed restless, pausing mid-lesson, staring out the window. Catherine spent long hours in the chapel, her lips moving in urgent prayer. And then came the night when the convent fell silent. No one knew it then, but those final days have been full of warnings, signs that something was wrong, signs the villagers dismissed as fatigue or worry. Only later would they wonder, had the sisters known what was coming? Had they sensed the shadow that was about to fall over them? Because on the morning of March 26th, 3 lives would vanish, and the village would wake to a silence it had never known before. The night of March 25th, 1991, began like any other. The sun had set early, swallowed by clouds rolling in from mountains. The wind carried the damp smell of soil, and the streets emptied quickly as villagers retreated to their cottages. In places like this, nightfall was final. Once the lamps were doused, the village belonged to silence. At the convent, the 3 sisters followed their routine. Supper was simple: bread, stew, a shared prayer. The housekeeper who often helped them said later that nothing seemed unusual when she left that evening. The sisters were tired but cheerful, their voices low but steady. They thanked her, blessed her, and she stepped out into the chill night. It was the last time anyone would ever see them alive. Inside, the convent lights glowed faintly against the dark. Neighbors remembered hearing the familiar sounds: the creak of doors shutting, the bell rung for evening prayer, the faint hum of Margaret's voice as she sang. Then, as midnight neared, the village sank into stillness. Dogs stopped barking, the streets were still, and the convent windows darkened one by one. But something happened in those hours between dusk and dawn, something no one could explain. At first light, the convent looked unchanged. The small garden was untouched, its soil damp with dew. The chapel door was shut. Birds sang from the eaves. Nothing seemed out of place. But when the housekeeper arrived to prepare breakfast, unease struck her immediately. The kitchen was cold. No fire had been lit in the stove. No bread sat rising on the counter. The table was bare, not even a cup misplaced. She climbed the stairs, calling their names. No answer. The bedroom stood immaculate, beds neatly made, habits hanging in their wardrobes, rosaries coiled carefully beside pillows. It was as though the nuns had risen, dressed, and left in silence. But their shoes remained lined by the door, polished, ready for use. Panic seized her. She hurried into the streets, crying for help. Villagers rushed to the convent, disbelief painted on their faces. The sisters had been seen just the day before, walking through the square. How could they all be gone? The search began immediately. Farmers combed the fields, children peered into wells, men scoured the woods at the edge of the village. The river was dragged, the paths examined. Nothing, not a thread of clothing, not a broken branch, not a single footprint in the dirt. The police were called from the nearest town. They examined the convent with stern faces, notebooks in hand. But even they seemed unsettled. Doors were locked from the inside. Windows latched. No sign of forced entry. No overturned chairs. No blood. No broken glass. The sisters' belongings, purses, identification, prayer books, were untouched. It was as though the three women had stepped into the night and vanished into thin air. Theories spread like wildfire. Some villagers whispered of kidnappers, imagining dark vans pulling into the night and spirits too stunned to cry for help. Others leaned on superstition. The devil had come for them, or God had taken them away as punishment or reward. Children whispered of ghosts, pointing to the convent as though it had always been haunted. But there were darker whispers too. Some suspected the stranger seen at Mass, the man whose gaze Catherine had avoided. Had he returned that night? Had he lured them away one by one? Then there was the locked room. When investigators asked about it, villagers recounted what they'd heard, that it was never opened, that even the sisters avoided it. The police forced it open, splintering the wood. Inside, however, they found only dust. Stacks of old books, broken furniture, forgotten vestments. No evidence of struggle, no hidden passage, no secret. Yet the air smelled faintly of dampness, as though something had recently disturbed it. The first days passed in a frenzy. Search parties spread miles beyond the village, through fields and woods. Posters were printed, photographs distributed. Tips flooded in. A woman claimed she saw 3 figures walking the roadside at dawn. A man swore he heard voices chanting in the hills. None of it led anywhere. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. The investigation slowed. By summer, the posters had faded. The search parties disbanded. The villagers weary of waiting for answers that never came. The convent remained empty, its windows shuttered, the chapel candles burned down to stubs. The case went cold. For the villagers, life resumed, but never as before. Mothers forbade daughters from walking alone. Doors were locked at night. The church, once a refuge, felt heavy with shadows. Whenever the bell rang, it carried not comfort but dread. And yet, despite the silence, the story refused to rest. People kept asking, how could 3 women vanish without leaving a trace? Who had silenced their voices and why? The years that followed only deepened the mystery. But behind the unanswered questions lay something no one could have imagined. A truth hidden so close, so carefully, that it would take 2 decades for it to come to light. And when it did, it would shatter the very foundations of trust in the village. The disappearance of the 3 nuns shook the village, but it also drew the attention of the authorities. At first, investigators treated it as a possible case of missing persons, a simple matter of individuals gone astray. But as days turned into weeks and no sign of them appeared, the case grew heavier, darker, and far more complicated. The police questioned everyone. Villagers lined the church square, each asked to recount what they had seen, what they had heard. But answers circled endlessly. Some claimed they had noticed nothing unusual. Others swore they heard faint cries in the night. One farmer insisted he saw 3 women walking into the forest, their heads covered, though he admitted later that it might have been shadows. The lack of certainty made everything worse. The sisters had vanished, but without evidence, Every theory seemed both possible and impossible. Investigators began by considering the obvious. Could the sisters have left willingly? It seemed unlikely. Their vows bound them to the convent. Their habits rooted them to the village. None had family close enough to visit secretly. None had expressed discontent. But then, Catherine's unease returned to the forefront. Witnesses recalled how she often looked over her shoulder, how her prayers seemed desperate. Could she have been running from something and persuaded the others to follow? The police dug into their pasts. Letters were examined, journals searched, conversations replayed in memory. But nothing pointed to a plan of escape. Next came the theory of kidnapping. If someone had taken them, why leave everything untouched? Why risk carrying off 3 women at once, in a small village where the sound of footsteps echoed? The logistics seemed impossible. Yet the stranger at Mass lingered in everyone's thoughts. He had been seen, yes, but never again. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had Catherine seemed so disturbed by him? Investigators tried to track him. Descriptions varied: tall, thin, dark-haired, maybe foreign. But the trail vanished at the edges of the village, as if he had dissolved into the countryside. No records, no vehicle, no trace. Rumors swelled in the absence of answers. Some whispered of cults, saying the sisters had been taken for ritual or sacrifice. Others suspected human traffickers, imagining the women smuggled across borders. The most unsettling whispers accused the church itself. There were murmurs of corruption, of priests with secrets, of powerful figures within the church who might have wanted silence. Villagers remembered odd conversations, strange visits from outsiders who never returned. Was it possible that the convent itself had been hiding something? And if so, had the sisters uncovered it, only to be silenced? The locked room returned to suspicion. Though investigators had found nothing but dust, some swore the smell was unnatural, heavy with mildew and iron. Theories sprang of hidden tunnels beneath the convent, of chambers sealed with stone. Workers were brought in to check foundations. Nothing was found, yet the air of unease clung stubbornly to the convent walls. As weeks became months, the investigation stretched thin. Police searched rivers, lakes, abandoned barns. They dragged fields and questioned travelers on the roads. Every possible lead ended the same way, in silence. And with silence came frustration. The families of the sisters demanded answers, their grief sharp and public. Mothers cried at the church steps, begging for their daughter's return. The villagers grew restless, their trust in the police fading. The priest urged patience, but his voice trembled. The church tried to calm fears, but whispers only grew louder. The investigation stumbled into strange corners. A shepherd claimed he found scraps of fabric in the hills, but they belonged to an old blanket. A hunter swore he saw 3 women in the forest, but when led back, he couldn't find the spot again. Each false lead eroded hope further. By the end of summer, the case file bulged with reports and witness statements, but no answers. The police scaled back, leaving only periodic check-ins. For the villagers, it felt like abandonment. The 3 sisters were gone, and with them, the certainty of safety that had once held the village together. Children avoided the convent, darting past it on their way to school. Mothers crossed themselves when they walked by. At night, some claimed to see lights flickering in the windows, though the building was locked. Others swore they heard whispers drifting from the chapel, as if prayers were still being said by unseen voices. But the strangest part was the absence of closure. In most tragedies, grief comes with an ending, a body, a grave, a farewell. Here, there was nothing. No bodies to bury, no goodbye to speak, just silence. And silence is the most dangerous wound of all. The years dragged on. Detectives retired, their files handed down to younger officers who carried little interest in a case that had grown colder than stone. The villagers learned to live with the loss, but never to forget. At weddings, the sisters' absence was felt. At funerals, their names were whispered in prayer. The convent itself decayed. Paint peeled, windows cracked, the garden grew wild. Once a beacon, it became a husk, a monument to unanswered questions. Children told ghost stories about it. Lovers dared each other to touch its walls at midnight. And still, the mystery endured. No matter how much time passed, one fact remained. 3 women had walked into the night of March 25th, 1991, and they had never walked out again. What the villagers did not know, what no one could have guessed, was that the truth of their fate had never left the village. It was there, hidden in shadows, buried beneath years of silence. And when it was finally uncovered, it would expose more than just a crime. It would expose betrayal, corruption, and the darkest secret the church had ever held. Time is merciless. It erodes pain, yes, but also erodes answers. The disappearance of the 3 nuns had once consumed the village. Headlines screamed their names. Prayers filled the church. Search parties scoured hills and rivers. But as the years moved forward, the world shifted its attention. New tragedies, new mysteries, new headlines rose and fell. The sisters became a memory, a whispered story that belonged to the past. But in the village, they never truly left. The convent remained, though it stood more like a relic than a living place. Its garden, once meticulously tended, grew wild and unruly. Roses turned to thornbush. Ivy climbed the stone walls like a shroud. Birds nested in the broken rafters. The chapel bells rang less and less until, eventually, they stopped altogether. The priest who had once led the congregation grew older, his hair whitening, his hands trembling when he lifted the chalice. He carried the weight of the disappearance like a shadow. Some nights, villagers said they saw him sitting on the chapel steps long after midnight, whispering into the air as though speaking to someone unseen. Children, too young to remember the night of the disappearance, grew up hearing the story as a kind of village legend. They dared each other to run up the convent steps, to press their ears against its heavy wooden door. Some swore they heard weeping inside, though no one had lived there in years. The mystery settled into daily life like a scar. At every feast, every gathering, the absence of Sister Catherine, Sister Elena, and Sister Margaret lingered. Their families kept their pictures framed on mantels, their rosaries tucked into drawers. Mothers who had lost daughters kept setting plates for them at Christmas, unable to break the habit. The official investigation, meanwhile, dissolved into dust. Case files were transferred from desk to desk, each officer taking one glance before moving on to newer, more solvable crimes. Over time, the sisters' names were reduced to ink on fading pages in the back of a filing cabinet. But while the outside world forgot, inside the village the silence festered. A strange fear grew in the years that followed. People whispered that the convent was cursed, that it had swallowed the sisters whole. Stories spread of lanterns seen flickering in its broken windows at night. A traveler once claimed to hear chanting inside, though no one else could confirm it. Another swore they saw a figure in a nun's habit standing at the edge of the forest, watching silently before disappearing into the trees. Superstition thrived where truth had died. The priest tried to keep the congregation together, but with each passing year, fewer people attended. Massachusetts' trust in the church eroded. Where once the pews were filled with families, now only the elderly remained, clinging to faith like a lifeline. Some of the younger villagers left altogether, moving to cities where the story of 3 missing nuns was nothing more than an old curiosity. But those who stayed carried it like a burden, as if the land itself demanded they remember. And then came the anniversaries. Each year on March 25th, candles were lit in the square. Families gathered, holding photographs, reciting prayers. At first, the ceremonies were large, filled with hope that the sisters might still return, or that answers might yet be found. But as the years dragged on, attendance dwindled. The prayers grew softer, the candles fewer. The 30th candle burned just as brightly as the first, but it illuminated only a handful of bowed heads. Still, one person never missed an anniversary, the priest. His face aged, his body bent, but his presence was unwavering. He spoke of faith, of patience, of God's mysterious ways. Yet even as he preached hope, his eyes betrayed something else, a knowledge he could not share, a burden he could not release. By the early 2000s, 2 decades had passed. Children who had once whispered the story of the nuns had grown into adults, raising their own children with the same tale. The convent had become more ruin than sanctuary, its stones crumbling, its doors sealed. And then, in the 20th year, something changed. The priest, older now, friarier, began to show signs of restlessness. He wandered the village at odd hours. He visited the families of the sisters more frequently, asking questions that seemed strange. Had they ever noticed anything odd about the convent before the disappearance? Had the sisters spoken of fears or secrets? The villagers assumed it was age, that the old man was losing his mind. But he knew something. Or perhaps, more accurately, he could no longer suppress what he had always known. Because buried deep within the walls of the convent lay a truth that had waited patiently for 2 decades. And as the 20th anniversary approached, that truth would finally come clawing to the surface. The year was 2011. 2 decades had passed since the night the sisters disappeared. The convent had become nothing more than a monument to unanswered questions, its walls cloaked in ivy, its windows broken, its garden overrun. Few dared enter. Even fewer dared to speak of what had happened. But the priest could not let it rest. He was older now, his back bent with age, his hands trembling with every movement. Yet his eyes, weary though they were, burned with something sharper than memory. For years, he had buried his unease, convinced himself that the sisters had been taken by forces beyond his reach. But in the quiet of the nights, when sleep escaped him, he heard whispers. Not real voices, but echoes, reminders that something in that convent had been left unfinished. It was the eve of the 20th anniversary when he made his decision. He could no longer bear the weight of silence. He would return to the convent one last time. The door resisted him, swollen by rain and age, but with a final push it gave way, groaning on its hinges. Dust swirled in the beam of his lantern. The air was heavy with dampness and the bitter smell of rot. He walked slowly through the familiar halls, each step stirring memories he had long tried to suppress. The dining hall was still, its wooden table scarred by time. The chapel lay in ruins, its altar covered in cobwebs, candles melted into wax stubs. The silence pressed in around him, thick, suffocating. And yet, something pulled him deeper. He reached the corridor where the sisters' rooms had once stood. Their doors were shut, the same as they had been 20 years earlier. He opened them one by one. Beds neatly made, prayer books still resting on nightstands, rosaries draped carefully across pillows. It was as if the women had simply stepped out for a walk and never returned. But then he stopped at the end of the hall. The locked room. The same door the police had broken into all those years ago. The one they had declared empty. For years, it had haunted him. He had always wondered, why had it smelled of damp earth that day? Why had the air felt heavier there than anywhere else? Now, with his lantern flickering, he stepped inside once more. The room was the same. Forgotten furniture, stacks of yellowed books, vestments eaten by moths. Dust coated everything like a shroud. But as he moved the lantern across the floor, something caught his eye, a faint line in the dust, too clean, too deliberate, as though something had been shifted recently. His breath caught. Slowly he knelt. At the far corner of the room, beneath a pile of rotted cloth, he found a wooden panel set into the floor. The edges were worn, but the dust was disturbed, as though someone had once lifted it and replaced it again. With trembling hands, he pulled it open. A rush of cold air rose from below. The lantern's glow revealed a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. His heart pounded, but he knew he could not turn back. For 20 years, the village had lived with unanswered questions. If there was even the slightest chance the truth lay below, he had to face it. Step by step, he descended. The air grew colder, damper, filled with the smell of earth and stone. His lantern flickered against walls of rough rock, cut into a narrow passage. He followed it, his footsteps echoing faintly, until the passage widened into a chamber. And there, he froze. The chamber walls were lined with wooden shelves, cluttered with jars, candles, and objects he could not immediately understand. But it was what lay at the center of the room that made his knees buckle. 3 sets of bones, carefully arranged side by side, still clad in the remnants of black habits. Their rosaries lay clasped in brittle fingers. Their skulls rested, as if in eternal prayer. Time had reduced them to silence, but their presence was undeniable. The missing sisters had never left the convent. They had been here all along. The priest fell to his knees, the lantern shaking in his grip. His mind swirled with questions. Who had done this? How had their bodies remained hidden from the police, the villagers, everyone who had searched so desperately? And then he noticed something else. Beside the remains lay a small chest. Its lid was cracked, its lock broken. Inside were pages of parchment, handwritten in Latin. Prayers, yes, but twisted ones. Invocations not of God, but of something else. Margins filled with symbols he did not recognize. Diagrams that chilled him to the bone. Suddenly, the stories of chanting, of lights in the convent, of shadows moving in the night, they all seemed to take on new meaning. Had the sisters stumbled onto something they should never have seen? Or had someone in their midst led them into it? The priest's tears blurred his vision as he clutched the rosaries from their fragile fingers. He whispered their names into the silence, his voice cracking with sorrow. But grief was not all that filled him. Beneath it lay terror. Because if these bones had been hidden so carefully, so deliberately, it meant someone had put them here. Someone who had lived among them, prayed among them, and betrayed them in the darkest way imaginable. And that someone had walked free for 20 years. The priest staggered back up the passage, clutching the rosaries, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He knew the discovery would tear the village apart. He knew it would drag old fears and suspicions into the light. But the truth could no longer stay buried. The 3 sisters had vanished without a trace in 1991. And now, 2 decades later, their silence had finally been broken. The morning after his discovery, the priest emerged from the convent pale and trembling. His hands clutched the rosaries he had carried up from the darkness below, his cassock stained with the dust of the hidden chamber. Villagers who saw him stagger through the square whispered among themselves. Something had changed. By noon, word spread like wildfire. After 20 years of silence, the missing sisters had been found. Or at least, what was left of them. The police were summoned once more, though many of the officers now were children when the nuns first vanished. They approached the convent reluctantly, their faces set with unease. The village had long been considered cursed, and none of them wanted to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. But the priest insisted. He led them into the hidden room, his lantern trembling as he showed them the remains. The officers stood frozen, their boots scuffing against stone, their eyes fixed on the bones dressed in the remnants of habits. For a long while, no one spoke. When they finally did, it was in hushed voices. Questions came quick and sharp. How could this chamber have been missed during the original search? Who had access to it? Why had the remains been laid out so carefully, as though placed in ritual? And, perhaps most disturbingly, who had placed the writings in the chest? The discovery divided the village instantly. Some were relieved. The sisters were no longer lost to some faraway fate. They had been here, close, all along. Others felt betrayed, furious that the truth had been hidden for so long. How could the police have overlooked the chamber? Or worse, had someone deliberately kept it from them? Whispers turned to accusations. Fingers pointed toward old neighbors, toward strangers who had once visited the church, even toward the priest himself. Had he known more than he ever admitted? Had he kept silent to protect someone? The priest denied it, but unease spread. Some villagers remembered odd details from the past. The way he had grown restless in the months after the disappearance. The way he sometimes avoided questions with vague assurances of God's will. But if not him, then who? Attention shifted to the sisters themselves. The writings found in the chest, strange, unsettling pages filled with symbols, became the center of speculation. Some claimed the sisters had discovered forbidden texts, remnants of something dark hidden within the convent for decades. Others insisted the sisters themselves had been drawn into rituals, lured by promises of visions or miracles. The families of the nuns resisted such claims. They remembered Catherine's warmth, Elena's devotion, Margaret's laughter. To them, the suggestion that their daughters and sisters had dabbled in something unholy was blasphemy. But rumors, once born, are hard to silence. The village fractured under the weight of suspicion. Old wounds reopened. Neighbors turned on one another, accusing, doubting, distrusting. Some believed the killer had been one of their own, a villager who had walked free for 20 years, hiding in plain sight. Others feared something larger, something that had never left the convent's walls. And then there were the stories. Those who entered the chamber spoke of unease that clung to their skin long after leaving. Some claimed to hear faint whispers in the stone passage. Others swore they felt watched, as though the darkness itself pressed in around them. One officer, after spending an hour cataloging evidence, refused to return. He told his colleagues he had felt a hand brush against his shoulder, though no one had stood behind him. He resigned days later. The discovery had not brought peace. It had reignited fear. As weeks passed, investigators pored over the writings. Experts in Latin and theology were consulted. The texts proved genuine, old, very old, filled with passages about shadows, sacrifices, and promises of eternal life. They were not prayers to God, but invocations of something nameless. This revelation only deepened the mystery. How had such documents come to rest beneath a Catholic convent? Who had placed them there? And what connection, if any, did they have to the fate of the sisters? The priest, though frail, became the focus once more. Reporters flocked to him, asking for his thoughts. He spoke softly, carefully. I believe they stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. His words sent shivers through the village. Because if that was true, then the question remained, what had silenced them? Some insisted it was human hands. Others were convinced something older, darker, had lingered in the convent long before the sisters ever lived there. But regardless of theory, one truth became clear. The sisters had not simply disappeared. They had been taken, their lives ended, their bodies hidden with care and intent. And the one who had done it had never been found. The discovery, instead of closing the case, had opened new wounds, new terrors. For the village, it was as if the ghosts of 1991 had returned, demanding justice. But justice, after 20 years, seemed as elusive as ever. The convent became the center of obsession once again. Police tapes stretched across its crumbling entrance. But that didn't stop curious villagers from gathering at the gates, staring at the silent building as though it might speak. Inside, investigators combed every inch of the underground chamber. Bones were carefully cataloged and carried away for forensic study. The chest of writings was secured, though copies were quickly made for analysis. But the more answers experts tried to extract, the more questions they unearthed. Forensics confirmed what the priest had already sensed. The bones belonged to Sister Catherine, Sister Elena, and Sister Margaret. Their habits and rosaries left little doubt. But the results also revealed something chilling. The sisters had not died at the same time. 2 of them showed signs of having perished around the same night. But the third, her bones bore marks that suggested she had survived days, perhaps even weeks longer. This revelation sent a wave of horror through the village. Which sister had lingered? Had she been trapped in that hidden chamber, praying in darkness as her companions lay still beside her? Had anyone heard her cries in those first nights? The thought was unbearable. And then there was the question of the chamber itself. It was not a natural cave. The walls bore marks of chisels, hand-carved into shape. The passage had been built deliberately, likely decades, even centuries, earlier. But by whom? And for what purpose? Historians were brought in, poring over church records, architectural notes, anything that might explain the existence of such a place. Their findings only deepened the mystery. Long before the convent was built, The land had belonged to an older monastery, one with a reputation shrouded in secrecy. Documents hinted at disputes between church leaders, whispers of rituals carried out in the name of purification, of practices that blurred the line between faith and heresy. No official records explained why the monastery had closed, but its stones had been repurposed decades later for the convent. Had the sisters unknowingly inherited a house built on buried secrets? And what are the writings? Experts in Latin translated them slowly, carefully. Some passages resembled distorted prayers, words twisted into pleas for visions, for immortality, for power. Others were harder to decipher, filled with cryptic diagrams and references to the shadows beneath the earth and the price of silence. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was this. The handwriting in some of the pages was not centuries old. It matched samples from the late 20th century. Someone had been adding to the book long after the original texts were written. Someone alive during the sisters' time, which raised the most disturbing possibility yet. Had someone within the convent, or someone close to it, been practicing rituals in secret? The village erupted with speculation. Old suspicions resurfaced. Some pointed to a caretaker who had once lived near the grounds. Others whispered of a visiting cleric who had spent long hours in the convent in the months before the disappearance. And some dared to wonder whether one of the sisters themselves had uncovered or even participated in these practices, only to meet a fate they had not foreseen. The priest listened to these whispers in silence. His health was failing, yet he carried himself with a grim determination. To him, the discovery was both a revelation and a burden. He confessed to some that he believed evil had taken root in the convent long before the sisters ever arrived. But when pressed for details, he turned pale, his words faltering. At night, villagers claimed to see a faint glow in the convent windows once more, though police swore no one had been inside. Dogs barked furiously at the gates, refusing to cross the threshold. Even the bravest avoided the grounds after dusk. The families of the sisters, torn between grief and anger, demanded answers. They wanted justice, but how do you charge a faceless shadow with murder? They wanted closure, but closure seemed impossible when the very ground beneath the convent whispered of secrets buried deeper than bones. And then came the rumors, darker still. Some claimed that in the weeks before the disappearance, the sisters had been visited by a stranger. Not the drifter once spoken of, but another man, dressed like a cleric, though no one knew his name. He had been seen speaking to them in hushed tones, walking the convent grounds at dusk. But no record of him existed in church files. No parish claimed him. It was as if he had stepped into the village, and then vanished, just as the sisters had. Had he been the one to lead them into the chamber? Or had he been searching for something already hidden there? The unanswered questions multiplied, each one heavier than the last. The villagers wanted a simple explanation, a killer, a confession, a crime solved. But what they got instead was a web of shadows, stretching back centuries, woven into the very foundations of the convent itself. And beneath it all lay one haunting truth. The sisters had not merely disappeared. They had been silenced. And someone, whether out of devotion, desperation, or darkness, had gone to great lengths to ensure their voices would never be heard again. Yet silence has a way of unraveling, and the discovery of their bones had loosened something that could no longer be contained. The convent never reopened. Its doors remained locked, the police tape long since weathered away, leaving only rusted locks and fading boards to guard its secrets. Weeds crept up through the cracks of its stone steps, and ivy swallowed its walls like nature reclaiming what man had once consecrated. But though the building decayed, the memory of what had been uncovered there refused to fade. The remains of sisters Catherine, Elena, and Margaret were laid to rest in the village cemetery. Their graves, side by side, became a place of pilgrimage, not just for locals, but for strangers who had read of their tragedy. Flowers appeared daily on their tombstones, left by hands both known and unknown. Some left rosaries, others scraps of handwritten prayers. and some left notes, desperate confessions and pleas, as though the sisters might still intercede from beyond. Yet for all the solemnity of their burial, the questions remained. Who had lured them into the hidden chamber? Was it a stranger cloaked in authority, a man masquerading as a priest? Was it someone from within the convent itself, twisted by obsession or by faith gone astray? Or had the sisters uncovered something ancient beneath their feet and paid the price for daring to reveal it? The authorities never offered answers. The investigation, stretched thin and choked by lack of evidence, eventually stalled. Files were archived, boxes labeled, and stacked in a cold basement. Officially, the case became what it had always been, unsolved. But unofficially, the story lived on. The priest who had made the discovery did not live to see many more years. In his final sermons, his words grew strange, fragmented but powerful. "The earth remembers," he whispered once to a hushed congregation. "And when silence is forced, it speaks again in ways we cannot bear." Some said he died haunted, his health consumed not by age alone, but by what he had seen beneath the convent floor. The villagers who once shunned the story began to tell it differently over time. To some, the three nuns became martyrs, women who had faced evil and kept their vows of silence, even unto death. To others, they were victims of something far more earthly: corruption, betrayal, and human cruelty. And yet, there were those who insisted on a darker truth still. They claimed that the sisters' spirits lingered, not as benevolent protectors, but as restless echoes, still searching for justice that never came. Night travelers swore they heard faint chanting carried on the wind near the convent ruins. Others spoke of lights flickering inside, though the building had long since lost its electricity. A few villagers whispered that if you stood at the gates and listened closely after midnight, you could hear the sound of three voices praying, not in harmony, but in sorrow. The chest of writings, meanwhile, vanished. At first, it had been sent to specialists for study, but somewhere along the line, it slipped into obscurity. Some believe it rests forgotten in a university archive, gathering dust among other relics of the past. Others suspect it was deliberately hidden or destroyed by those who feared what its pages contained. As for the convent itself, it became a place both feared and revered. Teenagers dared each other to creep inside on moonless nights, only to flee screaming at the first creak of the floorboards. Paranormal investigators arrived with cameras and recorders, eager to capture evidence of lingering spirits. And once, a group of pilgrims came, kneeling before the locked gates as though it were a shrine to holy suffering. But for the families of the sisters, no answer could erase the wound left by 2 lost decades of uncertainty, nor the horror of what was finally found. Their grief, even softened by time, remained raw. To them, the legacy of the story was not in mysteries or rituals, but in the faces of 3 women who had given their lives to God, only to vanish into darkness. Still, for the village, for the church, for anyone who had ever stepped foot into that convent, the case left behind a haunting lesson. Silence is never truly silent. Secrets buried always find a way to the surface. And some truths, no matter how deeply hidden, demand to be told, even if they come at the cost of peace. Today, the convent stands abandoned, its shadow stretching long across the ground at dusk. Birds circle its tower, and the air grows still as one passes its gates. To many, it is only a ruin. To others, it is a reminder of faith, of mystery, and of terror interwoven. And somewhere in the hearts of those who still remember, the question lingers, unanswered. Did the sisters die at the hands of evil, or in the presence of it? Either way, their voices, once silenced, continue to echo across the years, carried in whispers, in prayers, in stories like this one. The truth may never be fully known, but the memory of their vanishing, and of what was found in the earth 2 decades later, will never be forgotten.